Guys, you know that feeling when you finally found the perfect high-yield savings account and then the bank starts slashing interest rate faster than the durian dropping from the tree? Well, right after I posted a video just last month comparing the best high-yield savings account after the rate cuts, more banks decided to drop their rates again. And this is the reason why I have to do this video. To give you a summary, here's what's happening. Singlife is dropping their interest from 3% to 2% for your first 10K. This is effective of 1st of July 2025. Maribank is also slashing their interest rate from 2.28% to 1.88% per annum. GXS Bank has also reduced their rates to 1.98% per annum for the savings pocket and 2.28% for the boost pocket since my last video. And finally, UOB Stash has also reduced their interest from 3% to 2.04% per annum. So this is the video where I rank all the best high-yield savings account after all the cutting of interest rate. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which account is S tier, which is super tier, which is worth your money, and which ones are just meh. The chasing of interest rates can be challenging in this environment, and I hope to help, but everyone's situation is different. If you would like me to share how I am personally investing and where I'm at with all of these bank accounts, feel free to subscribe and comment yes please, and I will share my latest investment decisions. Because honestly, chasing short-term interest rates is taking too much time and too much work for it to be worth your effort. Everything that I will share is based on my research, and this is not financial advice. I am not a financial advisor. I am just your friendly neighborhood lobangs. And if you would like real-time updates faster than I can upload a video, feel free to join my Telegram channel. 8,000 people have already joined. So without further ado, this is my latest high-yield savings account tier list. At super tier, it is the OCBC 360 account, which offers 3.3% per annum for your first 100K. But you will need to jump through 3 hoops. The first one is salary crediting with a minimum of $1,800 per month. This must be directly transferred from a company bank account. The second criteria is to spend at least $500 on an OCBC credit card, not a debit card. And the third one is to grow your balance by $500 every month. And this is why I think that this is still one of the best accounts, because across all the bank accounts, OCBC 360 offers 2.75% of interest from a balance of $3,000 to $70,000, and then the rate increases all the way to a maximum effective interest of 3.3% per annum at 100K, which means that your optimal level is 100K. Above 100K, the rate actually starts dropping. So some of my Telegram members have asked me, so what do I do if I have hit the 100K tier? The answer is that the rates are actually still very good, and they still continue to win the next account all the way until an account balance of 116667. Yes, it's very specific. I do until so specific for you guys. For most people, I think this account is a lot more forgiving, because even if you don't fulfill all the 3 criteria, you don't lose all the tier. You only miss 1 tier. So example, if you're not able to hit the $500 of card spend, then you only miss that card spend interest, not everything. However, a warning though, if your OCBC 360 account balance falls below $3,000, they will actually charge you a $2 fall below fee every month. So that's why I put $3,000 and above for this cash saving requirement. If you would like to sign up for this account, feel free to sign up with the referral code below. I also have a video of which are the best credit cards that you can pair with this account, which you can watch here. The next account, which is still the S tier, is the UOB One account. The UOB One account allows you to earn up to 3.3% per annum if you spend $500 a month, either on the UOB One debit card or selected credit cards. You also will need to credit a salary of $1,600 via Gyro to hit a salary criteria in order to earn the maximum interest. A good thing is that this account is a lot more flexible, and you can easily fulfill the salary crediting requirement from your own POSB DBS account to transfer into your UOB One account, as long as you put the purpose of transaction as salary to fulfill the salary criteria. You want to note that this hack doesn't work for the OCBC 360 salary crediting criteria. So what I I will do if I have both accounts, the OCBC 360 and the UOB1 account, is I will have my HR credit my salary into the OCBC 360 account, then transfer the money to my DBS POSB account. Then from the DBS POSB account, I will manually transfer into my UOB1 account, putting the purpose as salary. Here's a detail that you don't want to miss. This account is best for those with 116667 to 180k worth of cash deposits. Once you hit 116667 of deposits, UOB1 account is actually better than OCBC 360 account. Between 116667 to 150k, your interest starts increasing, topping off at 3.3% at a balance of 150k. And what happens if you go beyond 150k all the way to 180k? The interest also reduces, but it is still not too bad, giving you an interest of 2.75% per annum. And after 180k, I think you would need to get both the OCBC and UOB1 account. If you want to know the best card strategies to pair with your UOB1 account to get the maximum interest, comment UOB and I'll do a video if a lot of people want it. A personal tip if you have more than 180k worth of cash deposits is that it is possible to have both the UOB1 account and the OCBC 360 account, as long as you are able to fulfill the criteria set by both individual accounts. During the editing of this video, Standard Chartered just announced a boost in their interest rate, and it makes them at S tier. It really looks compelling as we are able to earn a comfortable 3.05% per annum on our first 100k if we are able to fulfill two criteria. The first criteria is to credit a salary of $3,000 per month. And the second criteria is to spend at least $1,000 per month on a linked bonus saver credit or debit card. And that's not all, you can even boost it by another 2.5% per annum if you are able to invest 20k in a unit trust via Standard Chartered or make cumulative buy trades of at least 20k via the Standard Chartered online trading platform. I detail how we can maximize our card spend and achieve the investment tier via the blog post in the link below. And if it suits you, you can also sign up. The next is the A tier, which is still pretty good and it's a bit of a different kind of strategy that I will share. This is for those who don't want to jump through hoops like fulfill spend criteria, salary crediting. The first one is if you were to take advantage of the Maribank new user sign up promo. If you have extra funds and you are not yet a Maribank Savings Account holder, then Maribank could be a potential A tier for new customers. Because when you fund your account in June and you hold your funds all the way till the 31st of July, you can earn a promotional bonus interest rate of 1.2% per annum on top of 1.88% per annum. And that is 3.08% per annum worth of interest. This is great if you have extra funds lying around that you want to take advantage of. The second one is a more permanent rate, which is the GXS Boost account, giving you 2.28% per annum, but only if you lock in your money for 3 months. This is great if you have up to 60k that you don't need urgently. But you want to know that rates for the GXS Boost Pocket can change really quickly. If you see 2.28% per annum right now and you are tempted to wait till next week, GXS is more likely to reduce their rates with no warning. The thing is that GXS has a flexible lock-in, which means that you are actually able to still access the money if you need it anytime. However, the thing is that if you don't think that you can lock in the funds for 3 months, then there is a better alternative for you, which I will share next. In other words, if you decide to put into Boost Pocket, then it is really best to commit till the end of the holding period to the best of your abilities. If not, you will lose out on potential interest because you will only earn the base interest of 1.68% per annum. The next tier is the B tier. This is an account that I thought it was really good, and then after that it come and cut like haircut like that. Worse than haircut. It is the Sing Life account. With the Sing Life account, they have reduced their interest to 2% per annum for your first 10k. The good thing is that there is no salary crediting required, no card spend, no top-up required. This was generally the account that I thought was the most fuss-free and helpful for fresh graduates with not a lot of savings. And if you already have this account, you can continue to take advantage of the 3% interest all the way till the end of the month. Personally, I have 10K parked there, but after the 30th of June, I will actually move it somewhere else, possibly to Chocolate Finance, to earn 3% on my first 20K. Despite all the Chocolate Finance saga, their rates are slowly getting more and more attractive, even though withdrawals still take a bit of time. So if I'm a fresh graduate with 10K or less in total savings, and I don't want to jump through hoops, let's say I have 1K of monthly spending required, I will leave 3K inside this account for easy access, and it's still pretty great at 2%. And then I will put 7K into Chocolate Finance because I will still be able to access the funds in about 3 days. Do note that Chocolate Finance is not a bank and it is considered an investment because higher risk, higher reward. In this current market condition, there are no better options if we are not willing to jump through hoops. If you are able to jump through hoops, then definitely the OCBC 360 and UOB1 account will still be best. The next is the GXS Savings Pocket, giving you an interest of 1.98% per annum with no lock-in. This is lower than the Boost account, but the good news is that you can withdraw anytime. If you are not able to lock in your funds into the Boost Pocket and hold it there for 1 month or 3 months, then it is best to just put it here, because if not, you will only get 1.68% in the event that you do any early withdrawal from your GXS Boost Pocket. Also, from now until the end of the month, if you participate in their Pocket is Right contest, which I shared in the blog post below, you can potentially earn some extra cash rewards up to $20. Plus, you can get 3 months free View Premium and 2 months free Wall Street Journal Digital, free McAfee, Triple Protect, and Amazon Prime membership. If you would like to sign up, I'll put the referral code in the description below. In conclusion, with all the rates dropping, we are going to have to take higher risks for the same level of returns. So I hope this helps. If you want to know what are the credit cards that I currently use, you can watch my next video. Feel free to give a thumbs up so that it can motivate me to do more videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.